Instead, the road metal was quarried from halfway up the hill. The island now had a new owner, the National Trust for Scotland, who arrived just in time to save the day. In 1956, the previous owner, the Marquis of Bute, had died and bequeathed the whole island group to the National Trust for Scotland. In July 1957, the first inspection party from the Trust went to St Kilda just as the army was starting work. The party was led by the chairman of the Trust, Lord Weems. Boats were lowered with some difficulty, and with the Trust's flag flying on St Kilda for the first time, Trust Director Jamie Stormont-Darling, Lord Polwarth, and scientific experts James Fisher and Kenneth Williamson went ashore to assess what was to be done. They found a changed island. There were many decisions to be made, both by the Trust and by the Airfield Construction Branch of the RAF, whose job was to establish the tented camp for about 300 men below the village and to construct the road and radar buildings. Already the army had agreed to re-roof and repair the kirk as the camp, church and cinema, and the manse as the sergeant's mess. The village was another matter. What was to be done to prevent further decay and the loss of a unique heritage of building and island culture? The shape of the village street had survived remarkably well, but the graveyard wall was a typical example of work that cried out to be done. Meanwhile, there was, for the first time in 27 years, a new population on St Kilda, with many facilities like hot water and electric light that the indigenous islanders had never known. Totally strange to island life, most of the RAF personnel adapted quickly to the tough conditions, and many found a new interest in living close to nature for the first time in their lives. A young shag rescued on the beach got special treatment and special food. The St Kilda field mice were not quite so favoured when the quartermaster found they were especially partial to army bootlaces and Cadbury's chocolate in the stores. The weather in the appalling summer of 1957 was a real problem both to the road builders and to Chris Milne, faced with making this film for the National Trust of what they'd taken on at St Kilda. But at least he was able to record new life on Herta. 34 years after Robello and Mann's classic documentary of life in 1923, once again there was a queue for the pictures in the kirk, but this time for seasoned cinema-goers anxious to forget the weather. It's sad to think that many of these young islanders with little resistance to infection had later died on the mainland. Meanwhile, due largely to the commanding officer's drive and leadership, the road and radar buildings were completed, often in appalling conditions of wind, rain and Atlantic mist. The architecture of the technological era had reached the island of 1,000 cleats. Preserving buildings was not the Trust's only problem. Access for the public was the hardest task, solved in part at least by running summer cruises for those who could afford them. Those who were lucky enough to land could see the work that had been done by Trust working parties, cementing the ruined houses against further decay. Cruising with the National Trust for Scotland to remote places became something of a cult, based partly on personalities like Lord Weems as leaders. But one day in 1971, he was waiting at the pier in St Kilda for a very different kind of cruise ship and visitor, the Royal Yacht Britannia, bringing the whole royal family on the first ever visit by a reigning monarch to Britain's remotest inhabited island. This was a rare opportunity for the royal family to come ashore in relative privacy. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were welcomed by Lord Weems for the National Trust and by the officer commanding for the army contingent. The only cine camera present was that of John Wilkie, one of the leaders of the Trust working party at the time, who followed the tradition of Oliver Pike, Rebello and Mann, and John Ritchie, the unobtrusive camera recording events whose significance speaks for itself. This time it's only the Surrey sheep which run away. The inhabitants are only too keen on this occasion to show off their houses. These three 1860 houses had been re-roofed by the Trust as accommodation for future parties of volunteers. One house will become a museum for the many artifacts that have been found in the ruins, something that Princess Anne found particularly fascinating. Dr. Morton Boyd, director of the Nature Conservancy Council in Scotland, was also there to explain its role in running the island as a national nature reserve. And the warden was able to show the young princes a snipe's nest in the grass behind the village street. For all who were lucky enough to be there, it was a day to remember, a day of rare informality and relaxation for the royal family. A day of recognition for the Trust working parties, most of whose work goes otherwise unseen. It was a milestone in the St. Kilda story. In the first 50 years after the 1930 evacuation, St. Kilda has taken on a new life and a new strategic importance. More money has been spent here on defence than the islanders could ever have dreamed of. The army camp, now far more compact with its permanent buildings, fits unobtrusively behind the improved and extended pier at one end of the old village street. Herta is now crowned with radar installations largely designed for the safety of shipping in the zone into which missiles are fired from the South Uist rocket range. Its height and position are ideal for the purpose. The restored Factor's House is used by the Nature Conservancy Council for its resident warden and visiting scientists in their research work, especially on the fascinating biology and population of the Surrey sheep. Ear tags on the lambs and leg rings on many birds like the puffins are markers of the extensive use of St. Kilda as a kind of wilderness laboratory. The National Trust for Scotland provides a conservation effort. Every year, several work parties of a dozen volunteers under experienced leaders help in the work of restoring the buildings, a privilege they gladly pay for. Most then join the St. Kilda Club, open only to those who have spent a night on the island. They come usually quite untrained, but find it a rewarding, even inspiring experience. Perhaps that's why their crowning achievement has been the restoration of the kirk. Not only the building, but the precentor's desk, the pulpit, and all 14 pews have been either rebuilt from the originals or reproduced as faithful replicas. Even the windows are exact copies of what little remained in 1957. And alongside the kirk, the schoolroom has also been restored down to the last moulding on the fireplace, exactly as the children in this 1927 school photograph would have remembered it.